It's good to be back here, though, with my church family, and I'm thrilled to gather with you in worship this morning. It's actually a special day for Ashley and I. You guys ready to kind of do an awe? It's our 12-year wedding anniversary today. We'd take some applause, too. Would you bow your heads and pray with me this morning? Father in heaven, thank you for laughter and for a church family to laugh with and to gather with and to worship with. Father, this morning as we open your word, honor and privilege of serving as the chaplain at Sterling College, and one of my favorite things about that job is the incredible diversity in our student body. We have students that come from literally all over the world to little old Sterling, Kansas, and certainly from all over the country. And it's not just our locational diversity either. The student body is so wonderfully different in so many ways, and one of those ways is spiritually. We've got students who come in very deeply in love already with Jesus and wanting to grow deeper with him during their time at Sterling College. A lot of those students actually are in the room right now. I'm looking at many of them, which is amazing because finals ended on Thursday. Like, go home already, guys. No, it's okay. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for still being here and for joining us this morning. But of course, we have students who come in a very different place spiritually than that and in a different spot on their faith journey. And that's one of the favorite parts of my job, is to get to, hopefully as best I can, meet every student no matter where they're at and journey along with them as much as they'll allow me. But because of that spiritual diversity, I often find myself in conversations with students where they're wondering why I've made my whole life about this pastor thing. The question doesn't come out quite that baldly, but I've been asked some version of that question more than once. Like, why is your whole life about serving as a religious leader? Why is it about that pastor thing? And I understand in the mind of those students, it's probably like a really complex question, right? But actually, it's really simple for me. Really simple. The answer to that question of why I have constructed my life, built my life in this certain way is really, really simple. And the answer to that question at the first Christmas, or maybe even more specifically, why I've constructed my life the way I have, is because of who I believe happened at the first Christmas. I mean, to even put a finer point on it, my life is built the way it is for one reason and one reason only, and that's the person of Jesus Christ. Who I think, by the way, Jesus Christ, and this is not, sometimes preachers will do this, right? Hyperbole, overstatement. I genuinely believe that Jesus Christ was the most incredible man to ever walk the face of the planet. The most brilliant, the best leader, the kindest. Who was he really? Who was he really? And that's really what we're exploring during this Advent season. We just started a Christmas series last week called Who is Christmas? Which I think is a really creative question that Caleb came up with. Who is Christmas? We want to explore this question of who Jesus is, of who Christmas is, together here at King's Cross during this Advent season. And we're going to do that by diving deep into the matchless. And Jesus walks on the water, story that Caleb talked about. It shows in so many different ways how Jesus is so much more than just a man for us to marinate on, to really chew on and to think on during this holiday season. And actually, this characteristic of Jesus is summed up in simple teaching that we find from him in the book of Acts. Simple teaching that we find from Jesus in the book of Acts. Now, if you don't remember, the book of Acts is the story of how the early church developed after Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. So it might be a little strange to hear me say that this characteristic of Jesus is best contained in simple teaching of Jesus that's found in Acts. And it might especially be strange to know that this simple teaching of Jesus actually isn't directly found in either of Matthew, Mark, elders. And he has kind of had this whole moment with the Ephesian elders. And at the very end of his time, here's what we find from him in Acts 20:35. This is starting with Paul speaking here. He says, "And I, Paul, I've been a constant example of how you can help those in need by working hard. You should remember the words of the Lord Jesus." And here it is. So this isn't directly found in any of the four gospel accounts, but we know from the book of Acts that Jesus taught directly. This is a revolutionary thought. It is more blessed to give than receive. Directly from Jesus. Simple, direct teaching from Jesus. And let me just ask, how badly do we need this during the holiday season? Okay, fine. How badly do our kids need this during the holiday season, right? But if we're honest, don't we need this too? This is a revolutionary thought from Jesus. It is more blessed to give than receive. This morning, what I want to do is I want to dive deep with you into the characteristic of Jesus, of his generosity. His generosity. I think that this verse clearly displays that Jesus preached generosity. He preached generosity, but the old axiom, right? This old saying, it's a little bit cliche. Do you practice what you preach? I think it's a fair question for Jesus. He preached generosity. That's what Acts 20:35 reveals to us. But did he practice generosity? And now before we can answer Jesus, what I actually want to do is step back and I want to zoom out. And to be honest, I want to zoom out way before the first Christmas. I want to zoom out way before the first Christmas because sometimes in a teaching series like this, where we're going to spend so much time in the Gospels and we're zooming in so close to Jesus' time on earth, I think we can subtly, maybe not actually, but subtly forget that Jesus is the second member of the triune Godhead. Or you have God the Father, you have God the Son, Jesus, He who is Christmas, and then you have God the Holy Spirit. And the triune Godhead, in Christian understanding, has existed before anything else. And so why does anything exist? Now, of course, there are a ton of different ways to answer this question. It's like the farthest question. It's like the farthest question ever from something that we have consensus on. Right, this is one of the biggest possible questions that I could lay before you this morning, and people in this room might have different opinions. Certainly people across the globe and across time have answered this question in so many different ways. But here's what I think the answer is. This is maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but why does anything exist? I think it's because no one is more generous than the triune God. I think it's because no one is more generous than the triune God. Now again, just follow along with me just for a second here. The Christian understanding, as I've already said, the Christian understanding of the universe is that before anything else was, God was. Actually, the very first sentence, the very first words, the very first bit of our Bibles makes this clear. Word. With just a word, universe springs into existence. Mountains explode. The sea is separated from the land. Day is separated from night, all with just a word. Before anything. And I don't think it was because he was lonely. And I don't think it was because he couldn't come up with anything better to do. No, I think it's because the triune God is simply more generous than anyone else. No one is more generous than the triune God. You see, there has existed before, since all time began, a perfect, loving, generous relationship between God the Father, God. Out of that mutually generous relationship poured creation. Why does anything exist? Because no one is more generous than the triune God. Creation happened because God is generously loving and abundantly good. And I think we can actually track this idea farther through Scripture. We can move beyond the existential beginnings of the universe. We can move beyond Genesis 1:1, and I think we can track this idea that no one is more generous than the triune God. Follow along with me, if you will. The logic of it is this, right? If the triune God created everything, like nothing exists outside of God's creative and generously creative power, then it all originated in Him, and because of Him, and therefore it all belongs to Him. It all belongs to Him ultimately. And no verse, I think, displays the staggering. The implications of this verse, right? What that means is that if anyone owns anything, which is all of us in this room, by the way, if anyone owns anything, actually then we don't own it. It all ultimately belongs to God. What this means is that you're not an owner of whatever you own. You actually are a steward of what you own. You are a manager of what you own. You are entrusted to care for everything that we have because ultimately it's not them. You are a manager of them. You are a steward of them because ultimately they belong to God. And yes, this does apply to your money as well. Anything and everything that's in your bank account ultimately belongs to God, because the earth, therefore, and everything in it belongs to God. We're managers, we're stewards, God's the owner. And just are broken, we who are frail, we who are imperfect, we who are just like super duper greedy, He allows us to manage all that He owns. Like in one sense, you go, God, that's not a great management decision, right? Because we're so bad at it. And we so quickly forget that He owns it and we think we own it. Like in one breath, you're like, God, that's a bad management decision. And this is how we get back to Christmas, isn't it? Because what is the Christmas story if it is not God's abundant generosity on display? You know, I always make this joke. I have 3 sons. I'm not giving them to anyone. God had one son. And what did He do? He gave them. He gave Him to you and to me, those who did not deserve Him. But that's the story of Christmas. I mean, looked at it in that angle, the story of Christmas, I think, is one of what? Incredible generosity, because no one is more generous than the triune God. So let's continue to press it down, right? It's from before the foundations of the world, the existential question of why does anything exist, to this idea of managing and owning, Psalm 24:1, to even the story of Christmas itself, God giving us Jesus, we continue to press into this idea that no one is more generous than the triune God. And don't forget that the second member of that Trinity, the second member of the triune God, is Jesus. So let's press into His life. And let's ask the question, who is Christmas? Who is Jesus? Does Jesus practice what He preached? Friends, the answer is yes. Spoiler alert. On every page of the gospel, Jesus' generosity in His life pours out of Him. It pours out, it exudes out of Him. The answer to that question, does Jesus practice what He preaches related to generosity? It's a resounding yes. And I want to prove it to you. And I want to prove it to you not just with one story. I thought it might be more fun if we pull in a few that I think are exploding with His generosity. So let's see. Who is Christmas? Who is this generous Jesus? The first place I thought it might make sense to start is at the beginning of Jesus' vocational ministry. At the start of Jesus is really His first miracle. Okay, think about that. His first miracle, I think, explodes with His generosity. We're in John chapter 2, and Jesus and His family, His friends and His family, including His mother Mary, they're at a wedding. And Jewish weddings, if you don't know, they are a major ordeal. Jewish people celebrate at weddings for days. For days on end, there are celebrations. But at this particular wedding, a major problem comes up. They run out of wine before the party's over. It actually sort of reminds me of Captain Jack Sparrow, right? Why is all the rum gone? Now this again is before Jesus' vocational ministry has started. This is His first miracle. He hasn't really done anything yet. And His mom comes to Him. His mother Mary comes to Him. We just heard about her, right? She knows who Jesus is because an angel showed up and told her. Didn't we hear that? And so she's like, man, Jesus, this is a major party. And at first Jesus resists, but then eventually He decides to listen to His mother. So take note of that if there's any kids in the room. He listens to His mother, and what does He do? He miraculously turns the water into wine, and it's not bad wine. It's good wine. It's the best wine. It's the best wine. Generous Jesus, giving so that the party wouldn't end. Or my mind, right? That's John 2. My mind goes to Luke chapter 5. This is still early in Jesus' ministry. In fact, the story right before this one is Luke's account of Jesus calling the first disciples. So this thing is just getting up and off the ground, right? And there's a man who he's probably like heard rumors about this Jesus. Nothing's been verified yet because he heard rumors of this Jesus, and so he decides to risk it all. This man decides to risk it all because he has leprosy. And leprosy in that moment, it's a catch-all term for incurable skin diseases. But what would have happened to this man the moment, we don't know how long, but the moment that he would have contracted this disease as he would have been separated from and cut off from his community, from his family, from his friends. He would have been either living alone or he would have been living in a commune of similarly diseased people. And you have to wonder, has he had this disease for a long time? Is that why he's risking it all? Because what he does is he comes to Jesus, and they were not supposed to leave wherever they were living, separated from the community. I mean, this could be disastrous for him, but he decides to risk it all, and he finds Jesus, and he prostrates himself, which just means he throws himself at Jesus' feet. Drive home, right? At some point, go back and read Leviticus 13, because code that talks about how people should interact or really not interact with those who have these skin diseases. Touching them, it's like, read Leviticus 13. Don't touch, don't touch, don't touch, don't touch. These people were, anytime they were near non-diseased people, they were supposed to cover their mouths and yell out, unclean, 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 all for the purpose of everyone else knowing, hey, stay away from that guy. Hey, don't touch that guy. Hey, don't go near that guy. So again, probably this person had had this disease for a long time, and he hadn't been touched since the moment he contracted it. And I think we take human touch for granted. Didn't we? Didn't we see that in the social distancing moment? How much we took physical touch for granted. And we're talking about a person who hasn't been touched in maybe years. And what does Jesus do? He reaches out and he touches the man. Because he's generous Jesus, touching the untouchable. Or how about this one? Immediately before the story that in your Bible will be the feeding of the 5,000. And fascinatingly, this miracle of the, quote, feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle of Jesus, other than the resurrection, which just like coming back to life from the dead is also a miracle, but it's the only miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, that is in all four Gospels, other than the resurrection, which is really, really interesting. Because again, they didn't waste paper, because they didn't have paper. So if it's in all four, that means it's abundantly important. And this story is incredible, because the feeding of the 5,000 is actually a misnomer. That's how many men were there. We're talking about upwards of 20,000 people. And Jesus has been diligently teaching them, and they have been diligently listening. Perfect to feed all these people, except it's Sunday, and they're closed. Okay, you always want Chick-fil-A on Sunday. Portia, you know I'm right. You always want Chick-fil-A on Sunday, right? There is no solutions in sight. And what does Jesus do? He looks at his disciples and he says, hey, figure out how to feed all these people. Now, they understandably start freaking out, right? They are freaking out. It's Philip, I think. Yeah, Philip says in John's account of this story, John chapter 6, Philip says to Jesus, hey, Jesus, if we had 8 months' salary, we couldn't even buy enough bread for all these people. Like, of salary, if we had that sitting right here, it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be enough. So Jesus' disciples, they are freaking out. And then this is what happens. Follow along with me. John chapter 6, we're going to start in verse 8. One of the other disciples, Andrew, Simon's Peter brother, said to Jesus, well, there's a boy here. He's got 5 bars. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. He distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, this is it, as much as they wanted. Verse 12, and when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. So who has come into the world? Just like, we may be familiar with this story. So it kind of like 12 baskets from the 5 barley loaves. Like there's more baskets of bread at the end, 7 more baskets of bread at the end than there are like pieces or loaves of bread that they started with. And imagine with me that you're that little boy. I mean, this is why Jesus talks about the faith of children. Right? Philip's over there going, hey, if we had 3/4 of a year's salary, it wouldn't work. And then the faith of a child walks forward and says, this is what I've got. 5 loaves and 2 fish. He's handing it to the second member of the Trinity. He's like, I think this guy's got it. And Jesus did. I mean, this is generous Jesus, right? He's multiplying our meager offerings of generosity. I love the faith of children, and it's probably one of the reasons why I thought of this last story But Jesus said, let the little children come to me. Right? Jesus, again, I'll say it. Jesus was the most important person to ever live. Right? Jesus, again, I'll say it. Jesus was the most important person to ever live. It's actually not, it sounds like a big statement. Like our entire calendar is based on him. Like BC and AD is about when Jesus came, right? It's like our entire calendar system is based on the person of Jesus. No one has changed the world more than Jesus. He's the most important person to ever live. And at this moment, this is near the end, right? We've sort of gone from the beginning, John chapter 2. This is Matthew 19. We are headed near the end here. Now, it all hasn't crashed for Jesus yet, but he is at the height of his earthly power. He is at the height of his earthly fame. And I use the word earthly very intentionally because he gave up heaven and the riches of heaven to come to earth. But it built people throughout the course of human history. Take your pick. Really think about this. Get someone in your head, whether it's a king, a queen, right? The Queen of England's been the Queen of England for a really, really, really long time. She is globally known. Whether it's a dictator, whether it's a sports star, whether it's a tech CEO, whether it's Oprah, whoever it is, get this person in your mind. Think about someone incredibly powerful, incredibly famous. And now think about this. Can you picture any of those people doing this? Can you think about any of those people structuring their lives in a way and rebuking their followers to say, no, like let the children come to me? This image is from Sally Lloyd-Jones' incredible children's Bible. It's her telling of the passage that I just read where Jesus commands the little children to come to him. And I love this because it is so contrary. This is so different. This is so unique. Jesus is the most important person who has ever lived in the history of the world. And anyone that's ever remotely approached that title has not structured their lives in a way that they have time for little children. It just blows my mind that this is how Jesus lived his life. No, let the children come to me. The kingdom of God belongs to them, and he blessed them. Generous Jesus, taking time that no one else would to bless the children. Again, I could go on and on, story after story after story after story from Jesus' life proves that he, as part of the triune Godhead, practiced what he preached. No one is more generous than the triune Godhead. And we've now beautifully, I think, hopefully, wonderfully seen how Jesus fits into that and how he lived out what he has been living out since before time began. But where does it leave us? Where does it leave us this Advent season, this Christmas season? Well, I think it just really leaves us with one question. How can we be generous like Jesus? How can we be generous like Jesus? And I'll add this onto it. How can we be generous like Jesus, giving it all? Because, be clear with me, that's where the road of Jesus' generosity ends, right? It starts by coming. It was generous of him to come to earth and to humble himself, to be born as a baby. That was generous, the Christmas cradle. But what about the Easter cross? What about that step of generosity where Jesus spread out his hands and he allowed them and allowed his feet to be nailed to a wooden cross that was fashioned from a tree that he had made? What about that level of generosity? In that act, Jesus gave it all. He didn't hold anything back when he allowed for the good of those, for the good of the ones who are nailing me to this cross. Take it all. So friends, this Christmas season, how can we be generous like Jesus giving it all. There's this fascinating story near the end of Jesus' ministry in Luke 21. This is right near the end, right? Luke 21. He and his disciples, they're in the temple, and Jesus notices that different people are coming forward to give their financial offerings. Here's the story, Luke 21, verses 1 through 4. Jesus looked up and he saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw then a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contribute. This widow, the story has been called the widow's mite, the M-I-T-E, this kind of unit of money that she was giving, the widow's mite. Incredibly, it seemed like this woman did that. Right? It seems to be what Jesus is saying. She gave it all. Now, I'm bringing this story up actually maybe mostly because I think this story often gets misused. I think this story is misunderstood, and I think it often gets applied incorrectly, and it often gets misused. Here's how one scholar talks about this story. He says, in sharpest contrast to the false religion of the scribes is placed this story of a poor widow who gave 2 of the tiniest coins in circulation. These were pennies, as her offering to the temple alongside the gifts of the rich. And in God's sight, her offering was the greatest because God measures not so much the size of the gift, ... But stop there. Stop there, because I've stopped this quote short because I want to draw attention to the fact that I think this idea, God measures not so much the size of the gift, is how the story of the widow's mite has often been misused and misapplied. People stop here and they think, see, it doesn't. Next slide. In God's sight, her offering was the greatest because God measures not so much the size of the gift as of what remains to the owner. And we say it's what remains to the manager. It's what remains to the steward because it doesn't actually belong to us. We're not actually the owners of it. But this is the point Jesus is making. It's not the size of the gift. It's what remains to the owner. What remains to the owner. Now, before everybody gets really, really nervous, let me answer a question. Do I want you to give all of your income to the church? No, I don't want you to do that. Like really clearly, please do not give all of your income to the church. Like hard no on that, okay? But, and even like Jesus giving it all, this question is about more than money. Of course it is. Of course it is. I mean, Jesus proves this point. We can and should be generous with so much more than just our money. We can. But think back with me, if you will, to Caleb's sermon from a few weeks ago where he preached on the topic of money. And if you missed it, I highly recommend it. It's on our YouTube page. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. The best medicine to that disease, to give it away. So yes, this Christmas season, please be generous with all of who you are and all that you have. Please be generous with your time. Please be generous with your talent. Certainly do that. But maybe just ask yourself the difficult question of, am I being as generous as Jesus was with my treasure? Am I being as generous as Jesus was with my treasure? Because this Christmas, I want us to all be asking, including me, including Ashley, including Caleb and Nicole, how can we be generous like Jesus? Giving it all. The band can come forward, and I'm going to close us in prayer here in a moment. The prayer team during these last couple of songs and they would love to pray with you. Right now, we're going to pray, and then the band will lead us. So bow your heads with me. Father in heaven, thank you for your generosity. Your generosity knows no bounds. We can't outgive you because you are the most generous being in the entire universe. And may we take our mark from that, Lord. As your followers, as those who claim to live our lives based on who you are and the ways in which you lead us, may we be the most generous people that others in our lives encounter. May they walk away from encounters with us going, I cannot believe how kind and generous and loving that person was. I cannot believe how much they gave me in the generosity of this conversation, or how much they actually gave me because I was in need. May your followers, God, be the most generous people on this earth because you are the most generous. As we sing back to you, may this be a generous offering back to you, God, of our song, of our singing to you, singing with one another. May it please you, God, in this moment.